Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight I invite you to dim the lights, grab your blanket, maybe your questionable medieval-style beverage of choice. Let's be honest, it would have been watered-down ale because clean water was considered suspicious, and just drift with me into a slower time. A time when children weren't scrolling TikTok in bed, but instead were, well, shoveling things, catching vermin, or getting sold into an apprenticeship that sounded way cooler in theory than in practice, because tonight's story is all about the forgotten jobs of medieval children. Now, when we think of medieval kids, there are usually two stock images. One is the adorable page in shiny tights, maybe practicing knightly virtues, galloping around with a wooden sword. The other is the barefoot peasant child running after geese, probably with a smudge of dirt that's so permanent it's practically tattooed. But reality was much more obliquely practical. Kids were small, kids were expendable, and most importantly, they were cheap labor. And medieval society, much like every society ever, knew how to wring every drop of usefulness out of them. So, let's sink into it. Slowly, calmly, and with just a touch of sarcasm. Because if you don't laugh at some of this, you'll probably cry. Let's start at the bottom. The classic peasant kids. If you were born into a farming family, congratulations, you had a job. From the moment you could walk. Forget toys, forget preschool. Your early years were basically one long unpaid internship with the family business. Which, of course, was survival. Toddlers were sent to scare birds out of the fields. Not glamorous, but apparently very effective. Picture a 3-year-old with a stick yelling at crows. That's medieval childcare in action. As they got older, kids were expected to herd animals. Sheep, goats, geese, and all the glamorous livestock. Sheep were fine. Fluffy, slow, slightly judgmental. Goats, though. Goats are chaos in animal form. And you're, 8 years old trying to wrangle this horned demon that's smarter than you? Good luck, kid. And then there were geese. Geese, if you've ever had the misfortune of meeting one, are basically medieval attack drones. Loud, aggressive, willing to chase children across entire villages. So yes, putting your 9-year-old in charge of geese was technically a job, but it was also a punishment. But hey, at least the kids got fresh air. Now for slightly older children, around 10, maybe 12, there were apprenticeships. Sounds fancy, right? Apprentice to a blacksmith, or a tailor, or maybe even a scribe. You'd imagine this was a golden ticket out of Mud and Goose Duty. But here's the twist. Apprenticeships were basically a socially accepted form of child labor. Your parents would hand you over to a master, often literally sign a contract. And then poof, you lived with them for 7 years. 7 years. You were expected to work, learn the trade, and receive food and lodging. Payment, maybe a set of clothes. If your master was generous, and because kids were small and had tiny hands, guess who got all the fiddly, dangerous jobs? Yep. Little Hans with his still developing motor skills holding the glowing hot iron tongs. Or little Margaret, stitching until her fingers bled because she was cheap labor that couldn't unionize. But don't worry, at least they were learning a trade. Which was more than you could say for some other children. We can't talk about medieval childhood jobs without mentioning the gong farmers. Now, gong farming is one of those medieval careers that always makes it into the trivia books. It was basically being a human sewage worker. Gong meant, well, dung. The gong farmer's job was to climb down into cesspits, sometimes 15 feet deep, and shovel out everything people flushed away. And while adults did most of this work, children were often roped in, because children were small. They fit better into the pits, the literal pits. Yes. Imagine being 12 years old, lowered into a medieval latrine with a bucket and told not to suffocate. Because that was actually a hazard. The methane buildup down there was so bad, gong farmers could faint or die. But sure, let's send in little Thomas. He's small and agile, and we wonder why the Middle Ages get such a bad rap. Another thrilling career for the youth, rat catcher. Cities were full of vermin, and rats meant plague. So people paid good money to anyone willing to reduce the rat population. Enter the children. Again, small size, quick reflexes, and no one caring if they got bitten. Kids were sent into cramped alleys, into barns, even into sewers with sticks or dogs to chase down rats. And while it sounds heroic, most of these kids didn't have gloves, or shoes, or, vaccines. So every bite was basically a gamble. But hey, at least they got to contribute to public health, sort of. But not all jobs were dangerous or disgusting. Some were just weirdly specific. Take the role of turnspit boy. This was a real position in large kitchens, especially in noble households. You know how you picture a giant medieval roast on a spit, slowly turning over a fire? Well, someone had to turn that spit. And for centuries that someone was a child. These boys would sit in a little wooden wheel like a hamster and walk endlessly to rotate the meat. Hours of trudging in place, sweating from the fire, inhaling smoke. Also, sir, whoever could have perfectly roasted venison. Eventually, people actually bred a special type of dog, the turnspit dog, to replace children. Which raises the question, did dogs have a better union than kids? Possibly. Now, while peasants and apprenticeships took up most medieval children, noble kids had their own jobs. And while it's tempting to think of them as luxurious, most of it was training for a life that would probably still end in misery. If you were a noble boy, you might become a page around age 7, which meant being shipped off to another noble's household, because God forbid you get raised by your own parents. There you'd learn manners, serve at table, maybe polish some armor, and generally get bossed around. Later, if you survived puberty, you might graduate to squire, which is like an unpaid internship for knights. Your duties included carrying your knight's weapons, taking care of his horse, and occasionally standing very still, while someone practiced sword techniques on you. Noble girls, meanwhile, had jobs too. Mostly embroidery, which sounds sweet until you realize it was an endless cycle of needlework that could literally cause permanent hand injuries. Some were trained in household management, which was basically accounting plus babysitting plus making sure the beer didn't explode in the cellar. And of course the job of marrying whoever your family chose, which was less a career and more a lifelong sentence. And speaking of sentences, some medieval kids ended up as actual court entertainers. The line between child and dwarf and jester was blurry in medieval courts. Some children with unusual appearances were forced into these roles. They'd sing, dance, or just exist as curiosities, which is a polite way of saying they were treated as living toys for adults. But hey, at least they weren't in the cesspit. Always a silver lining. So let's float back for a second. The thing about all these jobs is how normal they seemed back then. Today, if a 12-year-old is seen selling lemonade without a permit, people panic. In the Middle Ages, that same 12-year-old might be waist-deep in sewage, or running after plague rats, or working 14-hour days for a blacksmith who occasionally threw hammers in his direction. It's a reminder of how childhood itself is kind of a modern invention. The whole concept of kids needing a special time of life to play and learn in safety. That's new. For most of history, if you could walk, you could work. And if you could work, you'd better contribute. Now, don't get me wrong. Not every medieval kid was in constant danger. There were games, festivals, and actual fun. Kids played ball games, sang songs, and even had dolls or toys if their parents weren't destitute. But the baseline expectation was labor. So while little Henry might get a break to roll a hoop with his friends, he was still expected to be back in the fields before sunset, chasing geese with a stick. Because medieval geese never took a day off, and that, my friends, is the gentle introduction to the forgotten jobs of medieval children. From goose wranglers to spit turners, from sewage divers to rat hunters, kids really did it all, not because they wanted to, but because society had a very simple motto: if you're breathing, you're useful. So let's pause here, take a breath, and in the next stretch we'll drift even deeper into more specific case studies, a few historical records of children in strange occupations, and what exactly people thought about child labor before anyone had invented the concept of labor laws, because, spoiler, they hadn't. Small hands, big problems. Hey guys, and welcome back. Still here, still awake? Well, if you're not, that's sort of the point. But if you are, let's pick up where we left off. We were talking about how medieval kids were basically the Swiss army knives of labor. Small, cheap, and unfortunately for them, remarkably expendable. So tonight we're going to wander a little deeper. Instead of just rattling off a list of odd jobs, we'll take a calmer stroll through some actual examples, records, and little glimpses of childhood work. Spoiler alert, it gets weirder. Let's start with chimney sweeps. Now, the peak era of child chimney sweeps was actually early modern, not strictly medieval. But even in late medieval towns, people had chimneys, and those chimneys needed cleaning. And who better to shove up a narrow, soot-filled hole than a small child? You'd be told, just climb in, scrape the sides, and don't die. Which sounds harsh, but that was literally the training program. Kids would climb inside with brushes or just cloth, scrape soot loose, and then, assuming they didn't suffocate, they'd wiggle back down like soot-covered ferrets. And if you're wondering, yes, sometimes they got stuck. And yes, the solution was usually send another child up behind them to push. Efficient, though maybe not what we'd call humane. But let's step outdoors for a breath of fresh medieval air, because another common child's job was scaring crows and other pests. This one pops up in manorial records all the time. A field might list 2 crow boys as part of its expenses. These kids literally spent their days clapping, shouting, and waving sticks at birds. It sounds simple, but think about it. Hours on end in the middle of a field just yelling at wildlife. That was your 9 to 5. Which means medieval childhood, in some cases, was essentially the beta version of being a scarecrow. Only instead of hay and a pumpkin head, you had boredom and sunburn. Now let's talk about the fulling mills. Fulling was part of cloth production. It basically meant pounding woolen cloth in water and clay to clean and thicken it. And before machines, that pounding was done by people or children, because kids could stomp, they could press, they could agitate the fibers. Some were even used in the early water-powered mills, where children had to load, unload, and handle the soggy cloth. Imagine standing ankle-deep in cold, soapy water for hours, stomping cloth in rhythm, because this was your job at age 10. Forget hopscotch. Your playground was industrial drudgery. Let's float into cities for a minute. Medieval towns were noisy, smelly, crowded places, and inside them, children had endless roles. One particularly grim but common job was apothecary's helper. It sounds refined. Medicine, healing, learning important skills. Except, no. It usually meant grinding herbs with a mortar until your arms ached, or handling mercury and lead with zero protective equipment. Kids inhaled powders, burned their fingers, and learned a lot, mainly about how much pain their little bodies could take before collapsing. And if you think safety standards were bad in modern child labor, medieval medicine laughed in the face of safety. Literally laughed. then poured a little arsenic into your tea. Now how about errand running? This one shows up constantly in city records. Families would hire children to run messages, deliver goods, or carry small loads. It was the medieval equivalent of Uber Eats, except instead of a scooter you had your own 2 feet, and instead of delivering fries you might be carrying a basket of live eels, which by the way were slippery and bitey. Nothing says childhood memory like having an eel wriggle out of your basket in the middle of a muddy street, while some angry cook yells at you. Speaking of animals, let's not forget the role of shepherd children. Shepherding wasn't glamorous. It meant long, lonely days outside, guarding sheep from wolves, thieves, and, let's be honest, sheep themselves, because those things will wander anywhere. Kids did this for pennies, or for food, or because their own families owned the sheep. And if a wolf showed up, too bad. A 12-year-old with a stick was apparently considered adequate defense, which, shockingly, it wasn't. Wolves could and did win, but at least you'd get a nice moral tale told about your bravery afterwards. Not that you'd be around to hear it. Now let's wander into noble territory again, because noble kids, while technically cushioned from cesspit duty, had their own humiliating tasks. For instance, cupbearer training. Young boys of noble families were often sent to pour wine for their betters. It sounds elegant, pouring a drink for a lord, except you were basically human furniture. You stood there silently, holding a cup, waiting for your lord to snap his fingers. And if you spilled, you might get smacked, or worse, suspected of trying to poison the wine, so no pressure, little 10-year-old Thomas. Just perfectly pour alcohol for a grumpy noble who hasn't had his dinner yet. Another noble adjacent role was page of the chamber, which basically meant being a servant. You'd fetch clothes, carry torches, stand around looking decorative. Again, not glamorous, but at least it kept you out of the fields. Unless your lord decided to hunt, in which case you were running through mud anyway, chasing after hounds. Let's sprinkle in something unusual. Child musicians. Yes, children were used as musicians in medieval times. Small fingers meant they could handle certain instruments like pipes or fiddles, and their voices before puberty were prized in choirs. Some were trained rigorously, others were just shoved on a stage and told to sing. And while choirs might sound safe, this was still the Middle Ages. Choir boys were overworked, underfed, and occasionally subjected to discipline that would make Victorian headmasters look gentle. Still, at least you could say you were contributing to culture. Between beatings, let's drift sideways into something a little darker. Child labor in mines. Mines were brutal. Narrow tunnels, toxic air, collapsing shafts. And yet, children were used because they were small. They could squeeze into places. Adults couldn't. Kids carried ore, hauled baskets, and even crawled into tiny crevices with candles, which, if you're thinking open flame plus methane gas, yes, explosions happened. So if you were 12 and unlucky enough to live near a silver mine, congratulations. You had a shiny new career path, and it was mostly downhill from there. Back in towns, another charming job, apprentice printers and scribes. Now scribes sound intellectual, copying manuscripts, illuminating letters, learning Latin. But again, this was work. Hours hunched over. A desk, eyes straining by candlelight, copying the same sentence over and over. Kids would cramp their hands, go cross-eyed, and occasionally misspell words, leading to pages being tossed out. And parchment wasn't cheap, which meant punishment. The printing press later added even more fun, inking blocks, pressing paper, and inhaling fumes. Medieval literacy had a cost, and that cost was usually children's eyesight. All right, let's lighten this slightly with ale making. Believe it or not, brewing was often a family business, and kids were absolutely involved. They carried water, stirred vats, cleaned equipment, which sounds fun until you realize boiling wort is scalding hot, and yeast isn't exactly forgiving. Still, this was probably one of the less miserable jobs. You learned to brew, which was practical, and you got to taste test, which might explain why some medieval kids were suspiciously cheerful in accounts. So let's pause for a second. What's the common theme here? Children were essentially viewed as miniature adults. There wasn't this idea that you had to protect their innocence or give them time to develop. You developed by working, you grew up by working. And if you died working, well, that was tragic. But someone else would fill your shoes. And it wasn't just peasants, even royal children had duties from the start. Writing letters, being paraded in ceremonies, or serving as hostages in political deals, which, to be honest, makes goose wrangling look pretty good. Before we drift into part 3 later, let's end this stretch with a single snapshot. In 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt in England, there are records of very young boys being used as messengers. They darted between villages carrying news because adults were too noticeable. These kids, probably 12 or 13, were literally the internet of their time. Except if you got caught with a message, it wasn't a delete button you faced. It's a reminder that children weren't background figures in history. They were working, sweating, and occasionally risking their lives just like everyone else. They just didn't get recorded much because who writes history about children? Well, tonight apparently we do. So let's float here. We've wandered through soot and sewers, through sheep fields and ale houses. In the next section, we'll keep drifting into how societies thought about children, what advice manuals said, and why people in the Middle Ages somehow convinced themselves that a 10-year-old was a perfectly reasonable candidate for hard labor. Because, of course, they did. Why everyone thought this was fine. Hey guys, welcome back. Or welcome forward, I guess. We've been wandering through fields, kitchens, cesspits and mines with medieval children, which is not the most relaxing imagery. But don't worry, we're going to soften things tonight by drifting into something even slower. Philosophy, religion and medieval logic. Because if you've ever wondered how people justified sending 12-year-olds into a pit of sewage, well, they had reasons. Not good reasons, but reasons. Let's start with the basics. In the Middle Ages, the concept of childhood as we know, it just didn't exist. The modern idea that children are little creatures who need nurturing, protection, school and structured playtime wasn't really a thing. Sure, parents loved their kids, but society didn't view them as fundamentally different from adults. If you could walk, you could work. If you could carry a stick, you could herd geese. If you could remember directions, you could run errands. And if you could hold a shovel, congratulations, you were a productive member of the economy. Now, where did this thinking come from? A lot of it was religious. Christianity dominated Europe, and Christian theology had a complicated relationship with children. On one hand, Jesus did say, "Let the little children come to me." On the other, theologians emphasized original sin, which meant kids weren't innocent angels, they were small sinners in need of correction. So if you're a medieval parent, what do? You put them to work, because labor was seen as moral. Work disciplined the body, work taught obedience, work kept idle hands from sinning. In other words, send your kid to shovel dung, and you're not just saving the village, you're saving his soul, at least in theory. Philosophers and writers doubled down on this. Take medieval advice manuals. They're full of stern warnings about idleness. An idle child is the devil's workshop, that kind of thing. Basically, play was suspicious, play looked like laziness, and laziness was one step away from sin. So when little Margaret was sent to chase crows all day, this wasn't just agricultural efficiency, it was moral training. Hours of yelling at birds taught her persistence, humility, and of course, the art of being sunburned into character. And then there's the role of social hierarchy. Medieval society was rigid. There were lords, peasants, clergy, and everyone in between, and each group had roles they were expected to perform. Children were no exception. They weren't free-floating individuals. They were extensions of their families. A peasant child was born into labor. A noble child was born into service, training, and arranged marriage. A clerical child, say one handed to a monastery, was born into vows of silence, obedience, and a lifetime of chanting. Nobody asked kids what they wanted. That wasn't really on the menu. Your role was fixed, your duties were fixed, and the idea of choice was about as distant as Netflix. Let's float into a very medieval belief. Small bodies, special usefulness. Kids were often assigned work because they were physically small. Narrow chimneys, narrow mines, narrow cesspits, all jobs that made adults say, we need someone small to fit in here. And boom, child labor was not just practical, it was necessary. It's like they treated children as living. Tools that happen to scream and need feeding, but tools nonetheless. Now you might wonder, did anyone object to this? Did anyone stand up in a medieval town square and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't send a 10-year-old into a plague-infested alley with a stick to chase rats? The short answer, not really. The long answer, a few people grumbled, but they weren't exactly starting child protection leagues. In fact, medieval law codes sometimes explicitly mentioned children's work as normal. Town charters, guild rules, and apprenticeship contracts spelled it all out. Apprenticeships starting at age 7? Totally fine. Children hauling loads in markets? Expected. Kids helping in workshops? Standard. It wasn't child labor. It was just labor. Let's drift briefly into monasteries, because yes, children worked there too. Medieval monasteries often took in oblates, children given by their parents to the church. And while these kids got religious education, they also did endless chores. Sweeping cloisters, copying texts, working in gardens, and theology again justified it. Serving God through work. The Benedictine motto was ora et labora, pray and work. And if you happen to be 8 years old with a shaky Latin hand, well, better start practicing. Eternity wasn't going to wait. Something else worth mentioning is how high mortality shaped attitudes. Medieval parents knew that many children wouldn't survive past age 5. Disease, famine, accidents, childhood was fragile. So people often didn't invest in long, leisurely childhoods. The logic was make the years count. Get the child working, useful, disciplined, before life snatches them away. It sounds bleak, and honestly, it was. But it explains why parents didn't always hesitate to send kids into risky jobs. Better to have them contribute while they were alive than waste time waiting for adulthood they might never reach. But here's the irony. Despite all this, medieval culture also loved idealized images of children. Art often showed the Christ child as innocent, glowing, pure. Poems sometimes celebrated children as symbols of joy. But in daily life, the glowing angelic child was a painting in church. The real kid was outside, covered in goose bites, hauling water, and being told to stop whining. So there was a gap between the symbolic child and the actual child, which is maybe the most medieval thing ever. A culture that adored symbolic innocence, but didn't blink at shoving the real deal into a cesspit. Let's take a short detour into medieval education. Because yes, some children were students. But don't get too excited. Education didn't mean carefree years of schoolyard games. It meant rote memorization, endless recitation, and occasionally being smacked with a rod for getting your Latin declensions wrong. And since discipline was considered essential, corporal punishment was not just accepted, it was encouraged. So even kids who escaped manual labor weren't exactly lounging around. Their job was to study, and study meant suffering. So whether you were herding sheep, shoveling dung, or conjugating verbs incorrectly, your medieval childhood had a unifying theme: work plus pain. And through all this, what about play? Did anyone think children should enjoy themselves? Actually, yes. Quietly in corners, play existed. Kids had toys, wooden horses, dolls, hoops, balls. There are drawings of children playing tag, wrestling, or rolling hoops through streets. But society tolerated it mainly when it didn't interfere with labor. Play was allowed, but it wasn't celebrated. It was the filler between jobs. So yes, medieval kids did laugh and play, just not for long. The geese always needed chasing. So, here we are. Medieval society thought child labor was fine because work disciplined children. Work saved their souls. Work fit their small bodies into jobs adults didn't want. And life was short, so why waste time on innocence? And that's how you end up with a worldview where a 7-year-old turning a spit in a hot kitchen wasn't pitied but admired for being useful. Strange logic, yes. But if we've learned anything tonight, it's that the Middle Ages were nothing if not committed to their own weird logic. Let's leave it here for now, floating on the gentle absurdity of medieval morality. In the next part, we'll wander into individual stories of specific medieval children, names that somehow survived the records, kids whose unusual jobs or unlucky fates gave us little windows into what life was like. Because as funny as goose wrangler sounds, it's even stranger when you meet the actual goose wrangler himself. Little names in big records. Hey guys, and welcome back again. At this point, you're probably tucked in, half asleep, wondering why you now know so much about goose wrangling. But that's the charm of medieval history. It gives us jobs no one asked for and details no one wanted. And yet, here we are. So far we've been talking about children in the abstract, the shepherd boy, the gong farmer's helper, the little scribe. But every now and then, medieval records give us actual names. Children who lived, worked, and occasionally complained loudly enough that someone wrote it down. Tonight, let's wander through some of those names. Real medieval kids with real medieval jobs. And of course, the jobs are every bit as glamorous as you'd expect. Let's begin with a boy named John le Turnspit. Yes, that was literally his recorded name. We find him in English records from the 13th century. His occupation, turning a spit in the kitchens of a noble household. And while that might sound like a joke name, it wasn't. Surnames often came from jobs. If your dad was a baker, you might be Baker. If you turned meat over a fire, you might literally end up branded with Turnspit. Lucky John. It's not hard to imagine what his life looked like, sitting in a hot, smoky kitchen, walking endlessly inside a little treadmill to keep meat rotating evenly. His whole identity boiled down to being small enough, poor enough, and obedient enough to keep meat from burning. And now, centuries later, the only reason we remember him is because someone scribbled John le Turnspit in a payroll list. That's medieval fame for you. Another glimpse comes from a boy named Robert the Ratcatcher. Records from London in the late 14th century list children employed to reduce vermin in city markets. Robert was one of them. He was given a stick, a dog, and the unenviable job of wading into stalls and cellars to chase out rats. It's possible Robert even got paid per tail. Some rat catchers were compensated based on proof of kills, which meant children literally carried around little bags of rat tails as currency. Again, imagine this. You're 10 years old, your school is the back alleys of London, and your homework is bringing home 10 tails or no dinner. Childhood medieval edition. Then there's Agnes, the goose girl. She shows up in a manorial account from Yorkshire around 1300. Agnes was responsible for watching over a flock of geese belonging to the local manor. The entry lists her payment as 1 loaf of bread and a little ale daily. That's it, her entire salary. So while noble kids were dining on venison and almond milk, little Agnes was trudging through fields, yelling at honking geese and being paid in carbs. She probably didn't complain, because complaining meant replacement. But still not exactly a dream career, unless you really, really loved bread. And then we meet William the Gong Boy. William appears in a record from a London guild, late 14th century. He was noted as the lad who helps the gong farmer, which, if you remember, meant shoveling sewage out of latrines. The record is vague, but it's enough. William was probably about 12. His job? Climb down into cesspits with buckets, scrape out the sludge, and pass it up to adults. We know methane fumes regularly knocked people out. Some died. But William was small and cheap, so down he went. It's the kind of job where the best outcome was, you made it out alive today, which honestly is not much of a career ladder. Now, not every recorded child was doomed to filth. Some ended up in more decorative roles, like Isabel, the child singer. We hear about her from cathedral choir records in Rouen, France, around the early 15th century. Isabel was listed as a pure cantatrix, literally a child singer. She was trained in chant and performed during services. Sounds beautiful, right? A little girl singing in a cathedral, voice rising into the vaulted ceiling. But the reality was endless rehearsals, strict discipline and hunger. Choir schools were notorious for underfeeding their kids. Singing on an empty stomach in a freezing cathedral probably wasn't as charming as the image suggests. Still, Isabel got to avoid geese. That's something. And then there's the strange case of Jakob, the miner's boy. In 1349, records from the silver mines in Saxony mention Jakob, who is small, and so works the narrow shafts. That's how he's described. No last name. No family, just small. Jakob crawled through tiny tunnels carrying ore in baskets, sometimes with a candle strapped to his head. And because 1349 was also the year of the Black Death, his odds of survival were already slim. Between plague, above ground and collapsing tunnels below, Jakob was basically medieval fate's favorite target. And yet someone thought to write him down. Maybe he survived long enough to make an impression, or maybe he just got paid 1 coin, and that was enough for a clerk to notice. Either way, Jakob's small body squeezed him into history. Now let's float over to noble circles again. Meet Henry Page of the Chamber. In 1415, a household roll from the Earl of Warwick lists Henry, aged 9, a page. His duties? Carrying messages, holding torches, fetching clothes. The roll notes that he was paid a tunic, a pair of hose and shoes. No money, just clothes. So Henry's life was essentially being an unpaid servant who got dressed up for free. But to be fair, pages had a career path. If he survived, Henry could become a squire and eventually a knight. Though, knowing medieval luck, he probably got trampled by a horse before age 15. But still, theoretically, upward mobility. And finally, let's peek at Margery, the brewer's helper. A brewing account from Oxfordshire in 1397 lists Marjorie, small girl, helps with stirring. She was about 10, and her job was to help her mother stir the mash during ale making. The entry notes she stirred well, which is both adorable and tragic, because that's the only praise history gave her. Marjorie probably worked long hours, carrying water and keeping fires going. But she got to be around beer, which was safer to drink than water. So maybe she was one of the happier kids in this lineup, until she burned her hand on boiling wort, which, let's be real, definitely happened. So there we have it. A handful of medieval kids whose names survived: John le Turnspit, treadmill boy of the roast; Robert the Ratcatcher, king of tales; Agnes the goose girl, paid in bread; William the gong boy, sewage diver; Isabel the singer, hungry choir angel; Jacob the miner, crawling through silver shafts; Henry the page, fashionably underpaid; Marjorie the brewer's helper, stirring away in the alehouse. It's not much, just little scraps in dusty records. But even those scraps remind us that medieval children weren't just nameless figures. They had names, jobs, and probably dreams. Though most of those dreams were interrupted by geese, rats, or fire hazards. So let's pause here gently, on the thought of Marjorie stirring her family's ale. In the next part, we'll drift into the larger picture again, what all of this meant for medieval families, how kids' work fit into household economies, and why, oddly enough, many parents considered their children's labor not just necessary, but something to be proud of. Because yes, apparently, my son the dung diver was once a point of family pride. Family's pride in the economy of small hands. Hey guys, welcome back again. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've officially outlasted most medieval apprentices on their first day. If you're half asleep, that's fine too. Just let my voice blend into the background while we wander slowly into the idea of family labor. Because the thing is, kids didn't just accidentally end up working in fields, kitchens, and cesspits. It wasn't a quirk. It was the entire foundation of the medieval household economy. Let's start with the simple fact that households in medieval Europe weren't just cozy little nuclear families. They were work units. Survival depended on every set of hands, no matter how small. A peasant household might include parents, children, maybe grandparents, and sometimes hired servants. But at its core, it was a team. And on that team, children weren't bench warmers. They were out there in the mud doing jobs that matched their size and strength. Small kids could herd geese or scare crows. Older ones hauled water or carried bundles of firewood. By adolescence, boys ploughed alongside fathers, and girls spun wool with mothers. The work wasn't an interruption of childhood. It was childhood. And the funny thing is, parents were often proud of it. Take the example of tax records from 14th century England. Some families actually boasted about how many working-age children they had. Why? Because more kids meant more labor, which meant higher productivity. To the taxman, children were basically line items of economic value, and to parents that was worth bragging about. Yes, I have 5 sons. 1 ploughs, 2 herd sheep, 1 is apprenticed to the smith, and the youngest fetches water. That wasn't a sob story. That was a medieval version of LinkedIn flexing. Now there's a strange little irony here. Medieval parents often loved their children deeply. They grieved them when they died. They celebrated when they thrived. And yet they also treated them as essential laborers. There wasn't really a contradiction. In their world, love and labor weren't opposites. Making your child work wasn't considered cruel. It was teaching them how to survive. If your daughter learned to spin wool at 6, she'd never go hungry as an adult. If your son could herd sheep at 8, he could eventually manage his own flock. So while modern ears might hear, "My kid was carrying buckets of sewage at 12" and cringe, a medieval parent might have smiled and said, "Yes, and he's doing a fine job of it." We can see this pride in household account books too. Lords and stewards sometimes wrote little notes about child workers, things like, "The boy is small but strong," or "The girl works diligently." These weren't emotional diary entries. They were performance reviews, and for parents they meant reputation. If your child worked well for the manor, it reflected on you. It showed you were raising responsible kids. Lazy children embarrassed the whole family. Industrious children made everyone look good. It's like the medieval version of bragging about your kid getting into a good college. Except instead of Harvard, it was, "He didn't drown in the cesspit today." Of course, not all families had equal opportunities. Noble families treated children's work differently. For them, pride came from service in elite households. If your son became a page in a noble court, you bragged, even if he was just fetching slippers. Because service at court was a stepping stone. Same for daughters placed as attendants in a lady's chamber. These weren't lucrative jobs, but they gave access to networks. So while peasants were proud of their kids' strong backs, nobles were proud of their kids' connections. Either way, pride and child labor went hand in hand. And here's another twist. Many families saw sending their children into apprenticeships as an investment. A father might pay a guild master to train his son. During that apprenticeship, the boy worked for free. He might sweep floors, carry coal, run errands, and maybe after years learn the actual craft. Parents often sent their kids away at age 10 or 12 to start this process. Was it risky? Yes. Some apprentices were exploited, beaten, or starved. But if it worked, the payoff was huge. A skilled trade meant independence. So again, parents were proud. Even if their child was sleeping on a shop floor, they believed it was the road to future security. Now, we can't float past this without mentioning one of the strangest features of medieval child labor pride, the songs and sayings about it. There are a few surviving proverbs that basically boil down to "the sooner kids work, the better." One English saying went, "Idle youth makes needy age." Translation: if you don't put your kids to work now, they'll be useless later. Even lullabies sometimes included little reminders about work. Imagine rocking a baby to sleep while singing about how nice it'll be when they're old enough to help in the fields. Sweet dreams, little ploughman. So what does all of this mean? It means that the forgotten jobs of medieval children weren't just about chores or survival. They were wrapped up in identity, pride, and family honor. To us, it looks like exploitation. To them, it looked like responsible parenting. And in a way, it explains why these records survived at all. If medieval parents hadn't been proud of their children's work, they wouldn't have recorded it. The only reason we know about John le Turnspit, Agnes the Goose Girl, or William the Gong Boy is because someone thought their labor mattered enough to write down. That pride turned into ink. And that ink, by accident, gave us history. So let's drift here for a moment with the image of a medieval family sitting around a hearth. The father sharpening tools, the mother spinning wool, the older children hauling water, the younger, ones chasing geese, nobody questioning it, everyone contributing, and the parents quietly, proudly thinking, yes, this is how it should be. In the next part, we'll wander into the murkier side of this equation, what happened when children couldn't or wouldn't work. Because not every kid was strong, healthy, or willing, and in a world that demanded labor, being unable to provide it could change everything. When children couldn't work again. If you're still with me, you're probably already wrapped in blankets, blinking slowly, letting this all slide past like the world's slowest river. That's perfect. Because this section isn't about noisy goose girls or sewer divers. It's about the absences, the gaps in the labor force, the children who didn't quite fit the mold. So let's begin with the obvious.
Not every medieval child was strong or healthy. Malnutrition was common. Disease was everywhere and accidents happened constantly. And when a child couldn't keep up, the household noticed. But what's interesting is how different families handled it. For peasants, a child who couldn't work meant lost labor, but it didn't always mean rejection. Parents often kept those children close, assigning them smaller tasks. If a boy was too frail to herd sheep, maybe he scared birds from fields instead. If a girl couldn't spin all day, maybe she watched younger siblings. The expectation was, everyone does something. Even if it was tiny, manorial records occasionally note children described as weak or small, often with a slightly pitying tone. One steward in 1320 wrote of a boy who helps a little, though not much. That's about as close as we get to sympathy in medieval bookkeeping. But there were limits. A child too weak to contribute at all? That was harder. Families already lived at the edge of survival. A non-working child was a strain. Some were quietly folded into care from extended family. Others, frankly, just didn't survive long. Harsh. Yes, but in a world without modern medicine, survival of the fittest wasn't a slogan. It was reality. Then there were disabled children. And here, medieval responses were a mix of cruelty, resignation, and occasional kindness. Chroniclers sometimes describe crippled or deformed children with bluntness that feels jarring today. One account from 14th century Paris mentions a boy with twisted legs who begged with his mother at the market. That was his job. Begging wasn't always a personal choice. It was sometimes the only available work for those who couldn't perform other tasks. But not all disabled kids were pushed out. In rural villages, children with limited mobility might still contribute through weaving, carding wool, or even scaring pests while seated. Work was elastic. If you could move your hands, you had a role. And yet we also see religious framing. Churches sometimes treated disabled children as living reminders of God's mystery. Families might keep them at home, not because they were useless, but because they were considered touched by divine fate. That didn't make their lives easy, but it did mean they weren't always abandoned. Now, what about the children who simply wouldn't work? Records are spottier here, but there are hints. A few sermons from the 14th century rail against idle youth who prefer games over labour. One preacher complained that boys in his parish were throwing stones and playing ball while the sheep go astray. Translation: medieval kids sometimes ditch their jobs to goof off. Human nature at work. Parents and masters usually dealt with this with discipline, which could mean a scolding or more often a beating. Discipline was considered normal, even necessary. If a child shirked, you corrected them physically. It wasn't seen as cruel. It was seen as training. And yet, despite all the sermons, despite all the punishments, they were probably still kids, sneaking off into fields, skipping goose duty, and inventing the medieval equivalent of I forgot. History just didn't bother recording their excuses. Now let's not forget mortality. Many children were simply too often sick. Fevers, coughs, stomach pains. Most of these were routine, but enough of them knocked kids out of work for days. And in a household economy, even a week of illness left a gap. Sometimes siblings filled in. Sometimes parents worked extra. But illness was part of the rhythm. Families didn't dwell on it. A child too sick to herd geese this week would hopefully recover by next. If not, well, there was always another child. That's not me being cruel. That's how families saw it. Children were precious, but they were also numerous, and mortality was constant. One curious glimpse comes from hospital records. In medieval Europe, there were children's wards in some hospitals, especially attached to monasteries. These weren't modern hospitals, of course, but they offered beds for children too weak or sick to work. Some stayed weeks, others never left. Monks sometimes recorded their little patients with affection. The boy was quiet with gentle eyes. The girl smiled even in her sickness. But again, no last names, just fleeting notes. The forgotten children of the forgotten jobs. And what about noble families? For them, a sickly or disabled child was both personal tragedy and political disaster. If your son was too weak to be a knight, what happened to your lineage? If your daughter was too frail to marry, what happened to your alliances? Suddenly, child labor wasn't herding geese. It was embodying dynastic expectations, and failure could ripple through entire families. We see cases where noble children were quietly hidden away. A daughter with a disability might be sent to a convent. A son who was chronically ill might be described vaguely as delicate, while the family prayed another heir would arrive. For elites, the inability to perform wasn't about daily bread, it was about dynastic survival. So here's the quiet truth. Medieval children who couldn't work, whether because of illness, disability, or rebellion, existed in a shadowy space. Some were still folded into family pride, given small roles, or treated as special. Others were sidelined, disciplined, or simply erased. And while history remembers the turnspits, the rat catchers, and the goose girls, it almost never remembers the ones who couldn't. Their absence is just as telling as any job description. So let's pause here gently, with the thought of a frail medieval child sitting by a hearth, watching siblings scurry around with chores. Maybe too weak to join in, maybe scolded for idleness, maybe cherished as different. Either way, history barely left them a trace. In the next part, we'll wander into something a bit more lively again, how children's work shaped the rhythms of medieval towns and villages. Because believe it or not, entire communities pulsed to the pace of child labor, from markets to harvests, bells to bedtime.
The rhythm of child labor. Hey there, welcome back. At this point, you might be halfway asleep, which is fine, because this section is basically about patterns, repetition, and rhythm, which, let's be honest, is perfect for bedtime. So, what? Did a medieval day actually sound like if you were a child at work? The morning often began with bells. Church bells, market bells, monastery bells. They rang across Europe not just for prayer, but as a kind of public clock. And kids responded to them. A shepherd boy knew he had to get the sheep moving by first bell. A girl spinning wool might begin at dawn light. In towns, apprentices were expected to open their masters' shops by sunrise. And if you weren't moving by the bell, someone noticed. Children's lives then weren't just ruled by parents or masters. They were ruled by the soundscape of bells and crows and clattering market stalls. Let's wander into the village fields. Harvest season especially turned into an all-hands event. Kids had jobs at every stage. Smaller ones ran through fields collecting stray stalks of grain, a task called gleaning. It sounds quaint, but it was serious. Every stalk mattered in a world where hunger was never far away. Older kids carried bundles or held tools ready for adults. Even toddlers might be plopped down on field edges to watch geese or scare birds away while the harvest happened. It wasn't playtime. It was integrated, expected labor. The whole village worked, which meant the whole village's children worked too. Now drift with me into a market town. Imagine narrow streets, muddy cobbles and rows of stalls. Here, children were everywhere. They carried baskets of goods, shouting to advertise their master's wares. They led animals, pigs, sheep or geese, through crowded streets. Some kids swept stalls, others guarded them when adults stepped away. A few unlucky ones ran errands all day long, weaving through crowds with messages. Markets pulsed with child labor. Without it, stalls wouldn't run smoothly. Which means, ironically, every loaf of bread or pot of ale might have passed through a child's hands before reaching you. The rhythm of domestic chores mattered too. In a village household, children often started their day by fetching water. That meant trudging to a stream or communal well, carrying back heavy buckets. Then came wood gathering, then helping with animals. By midday, younger kids might have to watch over infants, while older siblings spun, wove, or prepared food. Evenings had their own rhythm. More wood, more water, tending fires, cleaning up, then finally collapsing into straw beds. Childhood wasn't a pause between work shifts. It was the shift. We can also see rhythms tied to the seasons. In spring, children scared birds from new-sown fields. Summer meant longer days of herding, fetching, carrying. Autumn was harvest, chaos. Winter slowed down, but kids were still spinning, carding wool or mending clothes indoors. Seasonality ruled everything, and children learned that rhythm before they could read. Bells and seasons, chores and meals, that was their calendar. One fascinating detail, many medieval communities used children as timekeepers. In manorial records, we sometimes find notes like, "The boy runs for the priest at noon," or "The girl fetches the bell ringer." Kids weren't just living by time, they were keeping it for others. Imagine being 10 years old, responsible for telling the priest when to ring the Angelus bell. If you fell asleep or got distracted, the whole community noticed. That's a lot of pressure for a kid whose main hobby was probably throwing mud. And of course, let's not forget festivals. On feast days, many children were suddenly free from normal chores, but only because their labor was redirected into celebration. They carried torches in processions, sang in choirs, or performed in little pageants. So even when resting, kids were still part of the communal machine. Work didn't stop. It just changed costume. Now, what's striking in all this is how visible children were. In a modern city, kids' work is largely hidden. Schools, playgrounds, bedrooms. But in a medieval town, they were woven into every street, stall and field. You couldn't walk down a market lane without hearing a child's voice selling something. You couldn't look across a harvest field without seeing small bodies scurrying after stray stalks. Kids were part of the scenery, and in that visibility they shaped community life. A village without its child laborers simply didn't function. Of course, all of this rhythm had its downsides. Kids got tired, they slowed down. Sometimes they collapsed, and parents often responded with what looked like impatience, but was really necessity. If water wasn't fetched, the family went thirsty. If sheep weren't watched, they wandered off. So when we imagine lazy medieval children, we should be careful. A child dragging their feet to the well wasn't a symbol of rebellion. They were just exhausted. And exhaustion was part of the rhythm too. And finally, bedtime. What did medieval kids do at night? Most collapsed straight into bedrolls or straw. Pallets, often beside siblings. Some shared beds with animals to keep warm. Sleep wasn't romantic. It was necessity. But the rhythm of chores, bells, and markets often meant kids fell asleep quickly. They didn't have spare energy for dreams of freedom. Their lives were cycles of repetition, and the repetition was its own lullaby. So when you think of medieval communities, don't just imagine peasants ploughing and lords hunting. Picture children, everywhere, weaving the rhythm together. The little runners, carriers, singers, herders, the constant steady heartbeat of small tired feet. And with that, let's pause again. In the next part, we'll drift into something more awkward. Because while communities celebrated child labor, they also feared the opposite, idle children, the so-called dangers of laziness, mischief, and youth gone wild. Spoiler, most of this wildness was just kids being kids. But medieval adults loved to panic about it anyway. Hey again, still with me? Or maybe already half asleep. Either way, that's fine. This part is all about repetition, cycles, and rhythm, which is basically the lullaby of the medieval world. So picture a small village just before sunrise. It's chilly, damp, and faint light is sliding over the thatched rooftops. Before the grown-ups even stir, a child is probably outside. Maybe fetching water from the well. Maybe pulling on boots to drive animals from their pen. The soundscape is simple. A few roosters, a cart creaking somewhere far off, and a church bell marking the time. Bells were the medieval alarm clock, and kids answered them every day. Let's follow a shepherd boy for a moment. His job begins at dawn. He gathers the sheep, maybe with a stick in hand, and guides them out into the meadow. It's quiet except for the soft bleating. He'll sit out there for hours, sometimes all day in sun or drizzle, watching animals nibble grass. His rhythm is long, slow, and lonely. Now compare that to a girl in a town. She's awake by the same bell, but instead of a meadow, she's sweeping the threshold of her master's shop. Soon she's carrying baskets, running errands, or shouting out prices to lure customers. Her rhythm is busier, crowded, noisy, same age, different pulse. And let's not skip the smaller kids. A 7-year-old might not be hauling heavy wood, but they're still in the system. Maybe they're running around fields to scare away crows, clapping and shouting until their voice cracks. Maybe they're trailing their mother to the stream with a tiny bucket, struggling to lift it, but proud. Anyway, tasks weren't about efficiency. They were about training children into the rhythm of labor. By the time they were teenagers, they didn't need to be told. Their bodies already moved to the cycles of bells, seasons, and chores. Harvest season deserves its own moment here. When grain ripened, the village practically became one organism. Everyone moved in sync. Adults cut stalks, older kids bundled them, and younger ones gleaned, crawling through the stubble to collect every stray ear, the smell of cut grass, the sting of sun, the sound of blades swishing and voices calling. It was overwhelming. And in the middle of it, children worked tirelessly, often barefoot, their little arms scratched by stubble, their hands raw from carrying sheaves. By evening their legs ached, but there was no pause. After harvest, they still had to help haul the bundles to storage. Work didn't end when the sun went down. It ended when the pile was finished. Markets had their rhythm too. Imagine a crowded square, stalls crammed together, smells of fish, bread, spices, and manure all mixed. Children dart between the stalls. Some are shouting themselves hoarse, fresh apples. Others balance baskets, weaving through. Donkeys and carts. Some unlucky ones run errands all day, from master to customer and back again. They're basically medieval delivery apps, but without tips. At the end of the day, when stalls close, Kids are the ones sweeping, folding and packing. The rhythm isn't just the excitement of the market, it's also the clean-up after. And evenings at home, children dragged themselves back to households where work wasn't done yet. There was always water to carry again, wood to fetch, fires to tend. If you were the eldest girl, you might be spinning by lamplight, your hands sore but still moving. If you were the youngest, maybe you were rocking a baby sibling until your own eyes drooped. Finally, beds. Straw mattresses on the floor, sometimes shared with siblings, sometimes with animals. Sleep wasn't a luxury. It was collapse. The key thing here is that none of this was seen as unusual. Medieval communities didn't pause to marvel at hard-working kids. It was simply expected. Childhood wasn't an age bracket, it was a role inside the cycle. Medieval mischief and the fear of idleness. Hey guys, welcome back. By now you probably know the pattern. We start calm, we drift through the odd corners of medieval life, and before long, you're either fascinated or fast asleep. Honestly, either outcome is fine with me. So tonight, let's talk about something a little lighter, but still very medieval in its weirdness. The idea of idleness. Because if there's one thing medieval adults agreed on, it's this. Children left with nothing to do were basically tiny agents of chaos, mischief makers, sinners in training, miniature devils waiting to destroy the social order. Which is quite a lot of pressure if you're 8 years old and just want to play with a stick. Let's start with the basics. In a world where survival depended on constant labor, there wasn't much space for downtime. If you weren't working, you were wasting time, and wasting time was dangerous. Spiritually, morally, and practically, parents worried that idle children might steal, or gossip, or pick up bad habits from other idle children. And the church? Well, the church was very clear. Idleness was basically the devil's workshop. Even a little boredom was treated like a gateway drug to sin. So if your kid was sitting in the corner daydreaming, that wasn't adorable. That was terrifying. Of course, this paranoia didn't mean children never played. They absolutely did. But adults constantly tried to frame play as suspicious. Take ball games, for example. Medieval kids loved them. Too much, apparently. Town. Councils sometimes banned games of ball in the streets because children kept smashing windows, trampling gardens, or, in one glorious case from London, interrupting the mayor's procession by kicking a ball directly into it. Adults called this idleness. Children called it fun. Then there were pranks. Records from villages mention kids knocking over market stalls, throwing mud at each other, or running into fields they weren't supposed to. Small things, but enough to spark lectures about discipline and order. Even songs and rhymes worried adults. Groups of children chanting silly verses in the street. That wasn't harmless noise. That was disorderly conduct. Imagine a bunch of kids singing a medieval version of Baby Shark, and the town elders treating it like a moral crisis. That was the vibe. But here's the irony. Adults hated idle children, and yet they also sometimes used them because they were idle. If a messenger was needed in a hurry, guess who got sent running? The loafing kid at the well. If a master needed someone to hold his horse, he didn't pick the hard-working apprentice. He grabbed the nearest child sitting around. Idleness made you available labor, which meant once again, even doing nothing turned into work. Let's not forget the seasonal side. In winter, fields slowed down and children suddenly had less structured work. Adults filled that gap with lectures, moral teachings, sometimes even punishments for loitering. So while snow fell outside, kids who might have just wanted to slide down a hill or throw snowballs were scolded into spinning wool or memorizing prayers, because heaven forbid they enjoy themselves for an afternoon. The church leaned hard into this idea. Medieval sermons often warned parents that idle children would become thieves, drunks, or worse. One preacher even claimed that idleness in youth was the root cause of rebellion, which is dramatic, but also very on brand for medieval moralists. So in essence, a kid skipping chores wasn't just lazy. They were single-handedly threatening the stability of Christendom. No pressure. And yet, despite all the adult hand-wringing, children kept being children. They played games, they got into scraps, they skipped work when they could, and those little acts of mischief are actually how we glimpse their personalities today. Because the truth is, medieval records rarely notice children unless they're doing something wrong. If a kid worked quietly, they disappeared from history. But the moment they broke a window or played ball in the wrong place, suddenly they're immortalized in court rolls. So oddly enough, we owe our knowledge of medieval childhood to the very idleness adults feared. To me, that's kind of charming. Medieval parents and priests saw dangerous laziness. What they were actually looking at were kids being kids, restless, playful, stubborn, imaginative, and that little streak of mischief is probably the most human detail we have about them. All right. That's enough for now. Let's let that image linger. A muddy street, a group of scruffy kids kicking a leather ball, adults shaking their heads in disapproval, bells tolling in the distance. Mischief mixing with rhythm, idleness mixing with labor. Childhood in its messy little way, still finding room to breathe. In the next part, we'll drift into something heavier again. The way medieval laws and punishments treated children, especially when their mischief crossed into crime. Spoiler, medieval justice wasn't exactly forgiving even for 12-year-olds. So, dim the lights, settle back, and let's float there next. Hey, still awake? Good. Or maybe you're drifting off, which is honestly even better. Either way, let's stay with this idea of idle children, because medieval adults could never stop worrying about it. Think of it this way. To a medieval parent, the sight of a child just sitting still was unnatural. Children weren't supposed to be still. They were supposed to be fetching, carrying, sweeping, spinning, or learning their prayers. Anything else looked suspicious. So, when a kid stared into space, maybe doodling in the dirt with a stick, an adult saw not imagination but danger. Daydreaming wasn't cute. It was a gateway to sin. And sin, of course, was contagious. If one child daydreamed, others might join in. Before long, you had a gang of small rebels who weren't fetching water, weren't spinning wool, weren't watching sheep. They were just existing. Unacceptable. This led to a steady stream of complaints from adults. In towns, city councils actually passed ordinances against children playing games in the streets. Why? Because apparently a pack of rowdy 10-year-olds with a ball could ruin civic order. In villages, priests scolded parents about letting kids wander idly. Even court records show cases where children were punished not for theft or assault, but for idleness, which is hilariously vague. It's like being charged with doing nothing too enthusiastically. Now, let's peek into the games themselves. Children played at mock battles, chasing each other with sticks. They made little carts and raced them. They wrestled in the mud. They sang songs with rude verses. Adults, of course, hated this, especially the songs. One chronicler complained that children's rhymes were lewd and disruptive, but really they were just playground chants. Think of Ring Around the Rosie or clapping games, only in Latin, French, or Middle English, with slightly more farmyard jokes. Adults labeled all of this idleness, when in reality it was simply energy being burned off. And here's something else. Idle children were blamed for natural disasters. Bad harvest. Clearly too many lazy youths loafing about instead of scaring crows. Outbreak of disease. Well, perhaps the children weren't pious enough during prayers. Flooding. Maybe the kids were skipping chores and angered God. Basically, if anything went, wrong idle children made a convenient scapegoat. But here's the funny twist. Adults were also deeply contradictory about play. On one hand, they condemned it. On the other, they used it. At festivals, children were encouraged to dress up, sing, parade, and even perform silly plays. In those moments, play was suddenly innocent joy. But the next day, the very same behavior, singing, dancing, shouting, was idleness. So children had to navigate a weird double standard, be playful when commanded, but never on your own. The church, as always, had the final word. Sermons reminded parents that idle children were basically tools of the devil. Manuals for confessors even advised priests to ask children if they had wasted time. Imagine being 12 at confession and having to admit, "Forgive me, Father, I stared out a window for 2 hours." Apparently that was a spiritual crisis, yet despite all this hand-wringing, kids found little cracks in the system. They played games when adults weren't looking. They snuck out to fields, they carved wooden toys, tossed stones and splashed in streams. We know this not just from scolding adults, but from archaeological finds. Tiny dice, carved whistles, little balls, even miniature swords. Proof that children, no matter how tightly controlled, always found time for idleness. And maybe that's the most comforting detail. Even in a world obsessed with work, discipline, and obedience, medieval children still managed to be children. They annoyed adults, broke windows, made up songs, wasted time, and laughed at the wrong moments. It's the small rebellion that survived even under sermons and scolding. And it's the reason we remember them today, not just as workers, but as kids with actual personalities. So let's leave it there. A street full of children playing ball, priests muttering about sin, and parents panicking about the collapse of order. And somewhere in that scene a child sneaks away for a nap in the sun. Idleness in its purest form. In the next part, we'll shift into a heavier space. How medieval justice handled children. Because while mischief was scolded, real crimes, or even accusations of crimes, sometimes led to punishments that seem shockingly harsh today. For now, though, just let the image of playful idleness settle in your mind. Little bursts of rebellion, small moments of joy, hidden inside a world that feared them. Children and the long arm of medieval justice. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still with me after all these parts, that either means you're deeply fascinated or deeply stubborn about falling asleep. Either way, thanks for hanging around. Tonight, we drift into a darker corner, but don't worry, we'll keep it calm. No loud shocks, no jarring details, just the quiet, slightly absurd ways medieval justice treated children. Because believe it or not, even the smallest peasants weren't safe from the law. Let's start with a simple question. At what age did medieval society think you were legally responsible? Well, it depended. The church had one set of ideas, the courts had another, and communities had their own very flexible definitions. Generally, children under 7 were considered innocent, too young to understand sin or crime. But after 7, suddenly you were fair game. 7 was the age of reason, according to theologians. Which sounds nice until you realize it meant a 10-year-old could, in theory, be held to the same moral standards as a 30-year-old. So imagine little Geoffrey, age 9, stealing an apple. To us, that's childhood mischief. To a medieval bailiff, that's theft. a crime against property, a thing you could technically be whipped for. And the courts were not exactly forgiving institutions. In manorial courts, the local, village level, justice system, children show up in the records more often than you'd expect. Sometimes for petty theft, sometimes for breaking fences or letting animals wander where they shouldn't, sometimes for nothing more than disturbing the peace, which usually meant being noisy. The punishment? Usually a fine. But here's the fun part. Children didn't have money, so who paid? Their parents. Which turned the whole thing into a very medieval parenting lecture. Pay the fine and also control your offspring. Now, if you're picturing medieval police roaming villages arresting toddlers, not quite. Most of the time, punishments were about public shaming, not prison. A child might be scolded in front of neighbors, or told to sit in the stocks for an hour, or given a few lashes with a rod, small, quick, humiliating. Enough to scare them straight, at least in theory, but of course some communities went further. Because why not overreact when the culprit is 12? In cities, things got harsher. London records, for example, mention children as young as 11, being imprisoned for theft, sometimes even executed, though those cases were rare. Usually the child's age led to a reduced punishment. But the fact that execution was even on the table tells you a lot about medieval priorities. Property mattered more than childhood. The church had its own system. Children could confess sins, perform penance, and, in theory, face spiritual consequences. But priests often saw kids as both innocent and dangerously impressionable, which meant they obsessed over guiding them back to discipline. So a child caught stealing bread might not just be whipped, they might also be marched to confession, told to recite prayers, and reminded, very dramatically, that their soul was at risk of eternal damnation. For bread, it's bedtime preaching at its finest, terrifying enough to stick but vague enough to leave kids confused. And then there's the awkward overlap with work. Remember apprenticeships. If a boy in service to a master misbehaved, punishment didn't come from the state. It came from the master himself. Beatings, confinement, withheld food, all technically legal. Because masters weren't just teachers, they were disciplinarians. So a child's justice system wasn't just courts and priests. It was parents, masters, lords and neighbors. Basically, every adult around them was a potential judge. Childhood was like living in a permanent courtroom, where the jury never went home. Now, one detail I find both tragic and oddly funny. Sometimes children ended up punished for crimes that weren't even theirs. If animals escaped from a family, pen and damaged crops, kids sent to watch them were blamed. If a group of children played ball in the street and one window shattered, the unlucky boy caught holding the ball was fined. Medieval justice wasn't about fairness. It was about efficiency. Someone had to be punished, and the smallest target was easiest. But it wasn't all harshness. Communities also recognized that kids weren't adults. There are records of courts laughing off minor cases or giving symbolic punishments, like making a boy carry a heavy stone around the village for a day instead of paying a fine. Embarrassing but survivable. And in some places, adults even defended children. Neighbors might step in to say, "He's just a child, spare him," which suggests that even in strict systems, people understood kids were different. Still, the ISA general vibe was clear. Childhood didn't protect you from the law. It just made your punishment smaller, quicker, and often more humiliating. And that's what fascinates me. Today we talk about juvenile justice as a separate category. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't separate at all. Childhood wasn't a shield. It was just a slightly lighter sentence, so imagine it again. A muddy village square, a bailiff reading out names, and among them a 12-year-old boy guilty of chasing pigs into the wrong field. Neighbors laugh, the boy blushes. The parents groan about the fine. That was medieval justice for children. Half serious, half theatrical, and always a little cruel. And yet, in those records of punishment, we see the shape of childhood more clearly than anywhere else. Mischief turning into crime, daydreams turning into fines, games turning into moral panic. It's the adult attempt to control youth, and the youth constantly slipping out of control. All right, let's let that scene fade. In the next part, we'll float towards something even stranger. How medieval children were sometimes used as symbols in politics and religion. Not just workers, not just mischief makers, but literal icons, paraded, sainted, or sacrificed to make a point. For now, though, just let the image of that unlucky boy with his pigs drift in your mind. A tiny figure in the long, heavy shadow of medieval justice. So we've already drifted through the basics. Children weren't immune from punishment. They were just adjusted cases. But let's linger here a little longer, because the way medieval people thought about children and crime is oddly revealing. First, the philosophy. Medieval thinkers loved categories. They divided sins into mortal and venial, ages into childhood and youth, and crimes into petty or grave. But children sat awkwardly in between, too young to be fully guilty, but too old to be entirely innocent. This is why the age of 7 mattered so much. At 7, a child was said to have reached the age of reason, which sounds almost flattering, except what it really meant was, congratulations, you are now legally capable of sin, which also meant capable of crime. So, if a 10-year-old girl stole a loaf of bread, theologians might shrug and say, well, she knew what she was doing. She understood temptation, and the law followed suit. Now, in practice, most punishments weren't about violence, they were about spectacle. Communities believed that justice should be visible, which is why children sometimes ended up in the stocks, a wooden frame that locked your head and hands in place, not for hours, but sometimes just for a short, humiliating half hour. Enough time for neighbors to laugh and for the child to squirm. Other punishments included being paraded around with a sign announcing your crime. Imagine a child with a wooden tag reading "Thief" hung around their neck. Cruel, yes. But for adults, the point wasn't to break the child. It was to scare the other children watching, because in medieval logic, one child's humiliation might save 20 others from mischief. But let's wander into some specific cases. In England, a boy of about 12 was recorded for stealing shoes at a market. He was whipped and then released. The whipping wasn't unusual. What's telling is that the record made a point of saying he was young. It was shorthand for, we punished him, but not too hard. Another record mentions a group of children who broke into an orchard and stole apples. The case went to court, but the verdict was simply that the parents had to pay the orchard owner for damages. Again, the fine was less about crime and more about making parents take responsibility. And then there are the grim cases, rare but there. A boy of around 11 in 14th century London was hanged for theft. Chroniclers actually argued about it. Some thought it was excessive, others thought it was necessary to deter crime. The debate itself shows how unsettled adults were about child punishment. There's also the blurred line between mischief and crime. Take ball games. If children played in the street and broke a window, was that a crime? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Courts treated it differently depending on who owned the window. Break a peasant's fence, mischief. Break a wealthy merchant's glass, crime, or take animals. If you were a shepherd boy and the flock wandered into someone's field, that wasn't an accident. It was negligence, and negligence counted as crime, which meant you could be fined for sheep that didn't even belong to you. Justice medieval style. Harsh on the powerless, indulgent on the powerful. Children, being powerless, usually landed in the first category. One of the most haunting punishments for children was banishment. It wasn't common, but sometimes a child was simply expelled from a town for repeat offenses, usually theft. The logic was that the community couldn't reform them, so they had to go. Imagine being 12 told to leave the walls of your city with nowhere else to go. It's quietly brutal. And yet, to the medieval mind, it was merciful compared to harsher options. And let's not forget how justice intersected with gender. Boys show up more often in the records because they were more likely to be out in public, apprenticed, or working in fields. Girls' misbehavior was usually contained within households. Disobedience, laziness, backtalk, and punished privately, which means their crimes often went unrecorded, but not unpunished. Masters and parents held plenty of authority to discipline without ever calling in the law. So the silence in the records doesn't mean medieval girls were better behaved. It just means their justice system was domestic. What fascinates me is the contradiction. Adults constantly insisted that children were innocent souls in need of guidance, but the moment a child caused trouble, that innocence evaporated. Suddenly they were mini-adults, expected to know better. In that contradiction you can hear the anxiety of a society that never quite knew what to do with children. Too valuable to ignore, too unruly to trust, too fragile to fully punish, but too disruptive to let slip. So picture it again, the village square, the bailiff with his book, the neighbors whispering. A boy dragged forward, guilty of stealing a loaf. He's whipped or fined or made to sit in the stocks. It's not the end of the world. He'll go home, sore and humiliated, but alive. The lesson? Not justice in the modern sense, more like theatre, a reminder to the whole village that order mattered, and that even the smallest hands could disturb it. And with that, let's drift out of the courtroom. In the next part, we'll step into something stranger, how children weren't just punished but also used as symbols in politics, in festivals, in religion, sometimes celebrated, sometimes paraded, sometimes turned into little icons of innocence or sacrifice. But that's for next time. For now, just let the picture of that boy in the stocks linger, small, embarrassed, and oddly central to the performance of medieval law. Children as symbols, saints, and stage props. Hey again, friends. If you've made it this far, then congratulations. You've now listened to roughly the entire childhood of a medieval peasant, punishment included. Tonight, though, we're going to wander somewhere a little stranger, because children in the Middle Ages weren't just little workers or little sinners. They were also little symbols. To adults, children represented innocence, purity, hope, sacrifice, all the big lofty things people like to talk about, especially when those children weren't actually their own. So let's dim the lanterns, lie back and glide into the world where children weren't just themselves, but metaphors walking around in small muddy shoes. Let's begin with the most obvious. Religion. Christianity adored children as symbols of purity. Suffer the little children to come unto me, and so on. The idea was simple. Children were closer to God because they hadn't yet been fully corrupted by life, which is a nice thought, except it also meant children sometimes got used as props in sermons. Picture a priest preaching about humility. He plucks a child from the congregation, probably nervous, probably fidgeting, and says, "See this child, be like him." which, to the child, was probably mortifying. Imagine being compared to holiness when all you wanted was a piece of bread and to go home. And of course there were child saints. Plenty of them. Some real, some probably invented, all celebrated as martyrs or models of innocence. St. Agnes, supposedly martyred at 13, became the poster child for holy virginity. St. Nicholas, yes, that Nicholas, was said to resurrect 3 murdered children who had been pickled in a barrel. Cheerful stuff. The point wasn't the children themselves, it was what they represented. Innocence under threat, purity preserved, or divine protection. In other words, kids as religious shorthand. Now glide over to politics. Royal children weren't just kids, they were dynastic advertisements. A child prince wasn't a toddler in the nursery. He was the embodiment of an alliance, a treaty, a whole dynasty's survival strategy. Take child betrothals. It wasn't unusual for a 6-year-old princess to be married off, on paper at least, to a foreign prince. No wedding night, thankfully, just a contract. But the symbolism was powerful. Look, 2 kingdoms joined, sealed with the innocence of a child. And when a child king inherited a throne, oh, the propaganda flowed. Chroniclers would wax poetic about his angelic face, his untainted soul, his promise of a golden future. Never mind that the kid was still wetting the bed. To adults he was a vessel, a blank slate onto which they could project all their political hopes. Henry VI of England, for example, became king as an infant. Chroniclers described him as gentle, saintly, destined for greatness. Spoiler, he grew up to be mentally unstable, indecisive, and not at all destined for greatness. But at the start, his very childness was enough to inspire loyalty. So again, the theme, children not as themselves, but as symbols. Festivals added another layer. Medieval. Towns loved pageantry, and children made perfect stage props. Take the boy bishop tradition. Around St. Nicholas Day, a choir boy would be dressed up as a bishop, complete with robes and a staff, and allowed to rule the cathedral for a day. It was all very playful, a reversal of order, a reminder of humility. But also it was a reminder of innocence. The boy bishop was meant to show that even a child could embody sacred authority, which sounds flattering, but really, it was just another case of adults enjoying the spectacle of miniature authority without actually ceding any real power. There were also May Day festivals where children carried garlands, danced around poles, and represented springtime, renewal. Not because they particularly wanted to, most kids probably just wanted to eat the sweet buns handed out afterwards, but because adults loved the imagery of youth and nature entwined. One of the more peculiar uses of children was in miracle plays. These were dramatizations of biblical stories, performed in towns for the community. Children sometimes played angelic roles dressed in white, singing hymns, or sometimes they played sacrificial victims. Both roles reinforced the same theme, innocence on display, either exalted or imperiled. In a way, medieval theater invented the trope of the tragic child actor centuries before Hollywood. And we can't forget the darker symbolic uses, child death. Medieval chroniclers loved to use dead children as metaphors. If a royal infant died, it wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was framed as a divine message. The death of this child shows God's displeasure with the nation. Or, alternatively, this loss purifies the dynasty. It's grim, but it shows how children weren't allowed to simply live or die as individuals. Their lives were constantly reinterpreted as signs and symbols for the community. there's irony here. On one hand, medieval adults claimed to value children deeply, as heirs, as blessings, as little mirrors of God. On the other hand, they rarely let children just be children. Instead, kids were constantly drafted into adult stories. Religion, politics, theatre, morality. The child as saint. The child as king. The child as springtime. The child as sacrifice. All very poetic, and all very exhausting for the actual children, who probably just wanted to run around with sticks and steal apples. So as we drift here at the close of this section, picture a medieval festival square. A little boy in bishop's robes, wobbling under the weight of his oversized staff. A girl in garlands, holding a flower crown bigger than her head. Townsfolk smiling, priests preaching, parents proud. To them, these children weren't just kids. They were symbols of purity, of order, of renewal. To the children, probably just another long, tiring day, where grown-ups told them what to do. And with that, we'll float onward. Next, we'll move into the household again, but this time not with work or punishment, but with something softer. Play. What did children actually do for fun? Spoiler. It wasn't Fortnite. For now, just let the image of that boy bishop linger. Tiny, solemn, absurd, and perfectly medieval. Play games and the small escapes of childhood. Hey friends, we've made it through children working, praying, getting punished, and even serving as symbols of dynasties and saints. It's been a lot. But now, finally, let's give these poor, medieval kids a break. Because despite everything and the labor, the punishments, the endless symbolism, children did play. They weren't joyless little peasants doomed to drudgery from birth. They found time for games, jokes, toys, and nonsense. And honestly, some of their amusements are surprisingly relatable. Others, deeply weird. But all of them remind us that childhood, even in the Middle Ages, had its small escapes. So let's stretch out, breathe slow, and drift through the softer side of medieval childhood, the world of play. Let's start with the simplest, running around with sticks. Medieval kids didn't need elaborate toys. A stick could be a sword, a staff, or a horse. It could also be a weapon to hit your friend with, depending on the level of boredom. Parents might grumble about the noise, but honestly, sticks were free and everywhere. Then there were balls, leather, stitched together, sometimes stuffed with rags or feathers. Ball games were wildly popular, but not exactly standardized. Think less soccer and more a chaotic group of kids kicking a ball vaguely toward a goal, while also wrestling each other to the ground. Adults occasionally banned these games when they got too rowdy in the streets, which of course only made them more appealing. Kids have always loved the forbidden. Board games existed too. We're talking proto-checkers, dice games, and little strategy boards like Nine Men's Morris. Some were simple enough for children. Others were gambling, tools for adults that kids inevitably picked up. Imagine a medieval family evening. Father betting pennies on dice, children copying with their own clumsy rolls, mother sighing in the corner, and yes, children cheated. Chroniclers complained about it. Dice and cards, later on, were said to corrupt youth, leading to gambling sins. Because apparently nothing says fallen world like a 12-year-old sneaking extra throws. Now, toys. Toys were mostly homemade. Parents or older siblings carved little wooden animals. Rag dolls were stitched together from scraps. Clay figurines appeared in towns, cheap enough for even poorer families. Some surviving dolls have painted faces and jointed limbs. They look eerily modern, until you remember they probably smelled faintly of sheep grease. Children might dress them upstage little households, or bury them in the dirt when play turned chaotic. Miniature weapons were also a thing. Little bows, tiny swords. Because what better way to prepare your son for manhood than to let him stab his cousin with a wooden dagger at age 8? And then, animals. Pets weren't really pets in the modern sense, but children definitely played with animals. Puppies, kittens, geese and chickens all show up in stories of childhood. Sometimes lovingly, sometimes disastrously. Geese, by the way, were notorious for attacking children. So you can picture a peasant toddler chased around the yard by an angry goose, while adults laughed instead of helping. Classic medieval parenting. Outdoor games were huge. Hide and seek existed in forms. So did tag, blind man's bluff, and leapfrog. These weren't invented recently. They go back centuries. A monk in the 12th century even grumbled about children, wasting their time on chasing games, which of course means children loved them. There were also seasonal games. In winter, children slid on frozen ponds with bones strapped to their feet, the ancestor of ice skates. In summer, they played hoop and stick, chasing a rolling circle across the fields. Festivals often turned into playtime too. At May Day or Christmas, children got sweets, nuts, or little trinkets. Games spilled into the streets. Some communities even organized children's races, running contests with tiny prizes. It wasn't Disneyland, but it was a break from work. But here's the thing, play was never just play. Adults constantly tried to moralize it. Moralists scolded dice and gambling. Priests warned that ball games distracted from prayer. Parents fretted that dolls made girls vain or lazy. You get the idea. Every generation thinks children's games are corrupting them. The Middle Ages were no different, and yet the games went on. Children snuck moments of fun between chores, between lessons, between punishments. The very fact that adults complained proves how unstoppable play really was. One image sums it up for me. A medieval manuscript shows a group of children spinning tops in a circle. The tops whirl across the floor while the children crouch, laughing. It's such a simple, ordinary moment. No saints, no kings, no symbols. Just kids bored inventing fun out of wood and string, that's the heart of it. Play wasn't an escape from medieval life. It was medieval life, woven in between all, the duties and fears. For a few minutes you could forget about harvests or tutors, or the angry goose in the yard. You could just spin a top, or chase a hoop, or throw a ball, and that, for a child in the 14th century, might have been the closest thing to freedom. So let's leave it there. The sound of laughter, faint and fleeting, echoing through a muddy village square. Children at play, for once not saints or sinners, not heirs or workers, just kids being kids, and with that image, we'll drift onward. Next time, we'll ease into the later years, how medieval childhood ended, and what it meant to become an adult. Spoiler. It happened a lot sooner than you'd like, but that's for part 12. For now, let the laughter fade gently, like a top wobbling to rest. So far, we've seen children punished, symbolized, and worked half to death. But yes, medieval children did play. It wasn't all mud, prayers, and geese. Though, to be fair, geese still show up in their games, usually by chasing terrified toddlers around the yard. The simplest amusements were sticks and stones. A stick could be a sword, a horse, or an imaginary dragon. Stones could be targets for throwing, or little markers in games that looked suspiciously like proto-checkers. Children really didn't need much. Then there were balls. Leather, stitched together, stuffed with rags. Ball games were chaotic, loud, and often banned in the streets by grumpy adults, which only made kids love them more. Toys existed too, wooden animals, rag dolls, clay figurines. Some dolls even had painted faces and movable limbs. Surprisingly, modern if you ignore the sheep grease smell. Boys sometimes got miniature weapons, because nothing says training for adulthood like stabbing your cousin with a wooden dagger. Outdoor games included tag, hide and seek, leapfrog, and sliding on ice with bones tied to their feet, the earliest ice skates. Festivals brought even more fun, garlands, races, sweets, and a rare chance to just be noisy without punishment. Of course, adults scolded all this. Priests called games sinful distractions. Parents warned dolls made girls vain. And yet, the children kept playing. Which, honestly, is the most medieval thing about it. Joy sneaking in where no one expected it. So picture a muddy village square. Kids chasing hoops, spinning tops, shouting, laughing. For a moment, not saints, not sinners, not heirs. Just kids. We've talked about work, punishments, symbols, and saints. But even in the Middle Ages, children weren't little robots. They played, they laughed, they found scraps of joy between chores and lessons. And honestly, their games tell. Ask as much about their world as their labor ever could. The simplest fun came from whatever was lying around. Sticks became swords, staffs, or horses. Stones became targets, dice, or props in board games. Adults might have seen mud, but children saw endless possibilities. Some things never change. Ball games were especially popular. Leather balls, stitched and stuffed with rags or feathers, flew around village squares. There weren't really rules, just teams, chaos, and the occasional broken window. Town authorities often banned ball games in the streets. Naturally, kids played them anyway, because if adults say don't, children usually hear do it louder. Toys existed, though most were homemade. Wooden animals carved by fathers or older brothers, rag dolls stitched from scraps, clay figurines from local potters. A few dolls even had painted faces and movable joints, eerily like modern ones. Boys often got miniature bows or swords, because nothing prepares you for manhood quite like whacking your cousin with a wooden weapon. Animals doubled as companions and entertainment. Puppies, kittens, lambs, and unfortunately, geese. Chroniclers loved mentioning geese attacking children. So if you imagine medieval childhood, picture equal parts laughter and running away from angry poultry. Outdoor games were classics: hide and seek, tag, leapfrog, blind man's bluff. In winter, kids strapped bones to their feet to slide on frozen. Ponds, early ice skating. In summer, hoop and stick games rolled across fields. These weren't luxuries, they were just what children invented when they had a few free moments. Festivals brought rare treats. May Day meant garlands, sweets, and little prizes. St. Nicholas's feast might include nuts or coins for children. Some towns staged races just for the youngest, where the winner usually got bread or a trinket. Imagine the excitement of running for bread. That was medieval childhood in a nutshell, and yet adults constantly moralized play. Priests warned that dice led to sin. Parents claimed dolls made girls vain. Chroniclers sniffed that ball games wasted time. But despite the complaints, children kept playing, which says something simple and timeless. Joy has a way of slipping, shine even when no one approves, so let's leave this image in your mind. A muddy village square at dusk, a group of children spinning wooden tops. The tops wobble, hum, and collapse, while the children laugh softly. For once, they're not workers. Not sinners, not heirs, just kids. When childhood ended and adulthood arrived far too soon. Hey again, everyone. We've wandered through medieval children working, playing, getting punished, and even being used as symbols of innocence, saints, and dynastic hopes. But here's the thing about childhood in the Middle Ages. It didn't last very long. Tonight, we're going to float into that strange in-between space, when a child was suddenly not a child anymore, whether they liked it or not. No sweet 16, no 18th birthday party, no college years. Just a blur of apprenticeships, arranged marriages, religious vows, and hard reality. So let's settle in, let's slow down, and let's talk about how childhood ended in a world where growing up often just meant being handed more work, more rules and fewer excuses. First, let's clear something up. Medieval people didn't have our modern idea of teenagers. That whole category, the moody, angsty adolescent, with posters on the wall and questionable music choices, simply didn't exist. You were a child, and then you weren't. Legally, the line was blurry but important. By the age of 7, you could be held responsible for sin. By 12, girls were considered marriageable. By 14, boys could inherit property or enter contracts. And by your mid-teens, most people were fully expected to take on adult roles. So while we think of 16 as still a kid, in medieval Europe, 16 was practically middle management. Apprenticeships were one of the clearest markers of growing up. Around the age of 12 or 13, boys from towns might be sent off to live with a master craftsman. Carpenter, blacksmith, weaver, whatever trade the family could arrange. Apprenticeships weren't just about learning skills, they were about leaving home, living under another adult's authority, and being molded into a respectable worker. It was a mix of training and glorified servitude. Apprentices fetched tools, swept floors, and endured scolding. They worked long hours for little or no pay. But in return, they got food, shelter, and, eventually, the chance to become a journeyman. For parents, it was a relief. One less mouth to feed, and hopefully a secure future for the child. For the child, it was terrifying. Imagine being 13, sent to live in a strange house, expected to behave like an obedient adult overnight. Childhood didn't so much end, as it was traded in for an apron and a broom. For girls, the transition often looked different. At 12 or 13, many were considered old enough for marriage, which is a polite way of saying they could be married off to someone twice their age if the family thought it advantageous. Now, not every medieval girl was married that young. In practice, marriages often happened later, especially among peasants. But the fact that the law and the church said 12 was fine tells you how quickly girlhood could vanish. Even outside of marriage, girls were funneled into adult roles early. Helping in the household wasn't training anymore. It was permanent responsibility. By their teens, many were running kitchens, managing siblings, or spinning cloth for the household. There was no teenage limbo, just girl, then woman. Sometimes in the span of a single season, religion also swallowed up many children at this point. Monasteries and convents took in young boys and girls, often as oblates, children dedicated to the church by their parents. Sometimes this happened as early as 7, but the real break came in the teenage years when vows became serious. A 13-year-old girl could be veiled as a nun. A 14-year-old boy could take minor orders. Families liked this option because it saved on dowries or inheritance complications. Convenient, right? Just send a spare child to God. And again, for the child, this meant an abrupt shift from play and learning into a lifetime of strict routine, chanting, and cloistered walls. Whether or not they understood what they were signing up for didn't really matter. Adults decided, children complied. But let's wander into something stranger. Child rulers. When a king died and left a minor heir, that child was suddenly not a child anymore. They were the monarch, even if they were 5, or 3, or, in some tragic cases, still a baby, which meant that while regents and nobles ran the show, everyone treated the child as a symbolic adult. Chroniclers described baby kings as wise, gracious, or strong, because apparently nothing says wisdom like crying for milk in the middle of a council meeting. It's another reminder that childhood, for elites especially, could be erased the moment politics demanded it. Your age didn't matter, your role did. So what did this all feel like for the children themselves? Hard to say. Medieval kids didn't leave teenage diaries behind. No dear journal. Today I became a blacksmith's apprentice and I hate it. But we can guess. Some must have felt pride. A boy, leaving home to become an apprentice, might have felt grown up, important, ready to prove himself. The girl entering a household as a new bride might have felt honored, anxious, or both, but others must have felt fear, loss, or resentment, because no matter how adults framed it, as duty or honor or divine will, the truth was that children often had no say in the matter. One day you were playing with a wooden top, the next you were spinning wool for the family's livelihood, or carrying water for your master, or kneeling at the altar to take vows you barely understood. And here's the irony. Medieval society loved talking about innocence and purity, about the beauty of children. But when it came to their actual lives, childhood was treated as a temporary state to be discarded as quickly as possible. Play was tolerated. Learning was encouraged if useful, but the end goal was always the same: to make the child useful, responsible, obedient. In other words, to make them adults as soon as they could. So while we stretch out here listening to the quiet, imagine a medieval village where a boy of 14 packs his few belongings and leaves home to serve a master. Or a girl of 13, standing in a simple gown, promised to a man she barely knows. Their neighbors don't see children, they see adults, ready to step into their roles. Childhood has ended. Adulthood has arrived, not with freedom, but with obligation. And maybe that's the final lesson. Medieval childhood was short, fragile, and easily swept aside. To be a child was to be temporary. To be an adult was the permanent condition everyone rushed you into. So let's leave this part here, with the image of that boy apprentice walking away from home with nervous pride, or that young girl adjusting a wedding veil too big for her. Their childhoods, such as they were, already behind them. Tomorrow they will work, marry, pray, obey. But tonight, at least in our story, they are still in that fragile, fleeting space between. And maybe that's the final lesson. Medieval childhood was short, fragile, and easily swept aside. To be a child was to be temporary. To be an adult was the permanent condition everyone rushed you into. So let's leave this part here, with the image of that boy apprentice walking away from home with nervous pride, or that young girl adjusting a wedding veil too big for her. Their childhoods, such as they were, already behind them. Tomorrow they will work, marry, pray, obey. But tonight, at least in our story, they are still in that fragile, fleeting space between.